Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Look Up from Compass Media. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. Today we're joined by Peter Dunne, well-known online commentator on different issues, but also a specialist in agriculture and agricultural science. We'll talk to Peter about agriculture in a few minutes, as well as other topics that he has chosen. We're also joined by Anna Kavanagh, co-founder of Compass Media, and we're going to turn to Anna first after our introductions to look at the sentence of 15 years for the Strokestown demonstrators or protesters, I don't know what you'd call them, that were up in the special criminal court over the last year and that were found guilty and were sentenced yesterday. Peter, first of all, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Finbar. A pleasure.
And Anna, thanks for joining us. I know that you're under pressure, so we're going to get to your story first. And it's about the Roscommon Strokestown evictions. Could you give us some information about what happened this week and maybe a little bit of background to that?
Finbar, I was in courtroom number 6 yesterday in the Central Criminal Court when Judge Martina Baxter handed down sentences of 15 years to the 3 men. Martin O'Toole from County Mayo, Paul Byrne from County Roscommon, and PJ Sweeney from County Donegal. And the background to this story is that in December 2018, an agent acting for KBC Bank recruited an agency in Northern Ireland that was made up of a number of ex-British soldiers. And they came down to Roscommon, and in a very brutal eviction, they removed the McGann family, David, Geraldine, and Anthony McGann from their home on the 11th of December 2018. And then on the following Sunday morning, early in the morning at around 5 a.m., a group of men, between 30 and 40 men, arrived at the McGann's home, and they went in and they removed the men from Northern Ireland who were occupying the house. Now, these men who were hired by the agency in Northern Ireland, it was later found that they didn't actually have a license to operate in the Republic of Ireland, and the agency was convicted sometime later by Judge Deirdre Geraghty at the court in Castlereagh of being operating in the Republic of Ireland without a license. Now, what is remarkable in today's newspapers, and I think you have clippings from today's papers, the Irish Independent, the Irish Times, the Irish Daily Mail, and the Irish Examiner, is the uniformity of the headlines where the word mob attack is used to describe what actually happened on that Sunday morning. And I actually arrived on the scene at around 7 o'clock, just up from the McGann's home. And at that stage, the Gardaí were there, there were ambulances, and I reported live from the scene. Now, it is interesting that there was a huge gasp of horror when the sentences were handed down by Judge Baxter, 15 years. The men were convicted of 15 of 17 charges that were made against them by a jury at the trial, which began last February and ended last month. Now, I have done an online search overnight, and sentences of 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and in sometimes 8 years have been handed down for manslaughter, where somebody has actually died. But I was actually present in the court the day that the medical records were read into the court record. None of the men in that house that night actually sustained any broken limbs. They received bruising, superficial cuts. There were a number of them were admitted to the hospital in Sligo, and one was sent to the hospital in Mullingar. They were all discharged on the day and given prescriptions for painkillers and in some cases for antibiotics. So absolutely no limbs broken. And I suppose I am very, very close to that story. I met the McGann family on the Thursday, which was 2 days after the eviction. And you can see there, I have an image there, photographs that I took of David McGann. David is in his 60s, was in his 60s at that time, in very, very poor health. And he was actually dragged out by his ears across the Tarmacadam yard and thrown out into the middle of the road. And you can see there that, you know, his injuries. And I met him on the Thursday. That was a couple of days after the eviction, and he was still wearing those clothes. They were forced out of their home that morning by these men who came down from Northern Ireland, and as I say, some of them were British soldiers, ex-British soldiers, one of them an ex-PSNI man. And it was a very, very brutal eviction. And there was no attempt to mention the brutality of that eviction or the effects that it had on the McGann family. You know, in any of the reports that we're reading in the papers today of yesterday's sentencing. And, you know, this agency had been contracted by an agent acting for KBC Bank, and they had carried out a number of evictions prior to the McGann eviction. One of the evictions was particularly brutal, and it received coverage on social media. It was the eviction of the Smith family in Ballybrack in County Dublin. And what I find really, really horrific is that these men were operating in the Republic of Ireland without a licence, and they have been convicted of doing so. And since then, the Private Security Authority of Ireland have given them a licence, so they're now licensed to operate in the Republic of Ireland. Rossa Fanning was the senior counsel acting on behalf of KBC Bank throughout the many court appearances in relation to the McGann family and what happened subsequent to that eviction. Rossa Fanning is now the Attorney General, and KBC Bank has exited the country. And I'm reliably informed that the McGann's home and approximate 30 acres of land worth possibly, you know, 300,000 or 400,000 euro has since been transferred to a company in Northern Ireland for the sum of 10,000 euro. And, you know, a lot of people are saying, oh, you know, this has nothing to do with me. But in actual fact, it does, because this is a taste of what is to come. I believe that it's now open season for people who are going to get into difficulties with the banks. I'm told that there are currently over 200 cases listed in the High Court at the moment for repossession or eviction. And with the rising cost of living, with the rising interest rates for mortgages, more and more people are going to be getting into difficulties. Also, the collapsing price of milk. Many dairy farmers have borrowed huge sums of money to upgrade their milking parlours and put in robots and so on. And the price of milk has almost halved in the last year, which means that some farmers will not be able to meet their loan repayments. and it will be straight into the eviction courts for these men, and we're going to see a great deal more evictions in the near future. Also, the homeless figures were published yesterday, and they are now at an all-time high. And if you dig deep into the data, you will see that just over 28% of people who are currently homeless are homeless as a result of evictions. And when people are evicted, then it behoves the state to house them. So this whole saga has a knock-on effect on every citizen in this country. And I suppose my sympathies lies with those men, and also with the McGann family and with their many supporters. We must remember that the men who took part in the 1916 Rising, as they went down Moore Street, were pelted by rotten fruit. But, you know, later on, they were seen to have stood for something. They have stood for people's rights. And I feel that the Strokestown eviction, when history of this period comes to be written, will be seen as a landmark period in Irish history. It will be seen as a time when the state actually worked on behalf of the banks to evict people from their homes. And I think that this is something that is going to get much worse. And to quote Margaret Hanrahan, an activist who is helping people that are in difficulties with the banks, she's on record as saying that there is a tsunami of evictions coming down the line. And I suppose one of the people that she's told me about this week is a woman who had her arm broken in a number of places when the security detail moved in to evict her from her home. So it's truly, truly, truly shocking what is actually happening in Ireland at the minute.
It's a very, very significant sentence, Anna. It is, to my mind, especially when these men are not young men. To my mind, this is a life sentence, ultimately, is what these men have been given. As you said, there wasn't even a bone broken in this incident. There was bruising, there was scratches, things like that. All those men went home that night, safe and sound. And yet we have a situation where people who commit murder and manslaughter are getting quite limited sentences, and child abuse and things like that. Some people committing child abuse are walking out of court without any sentence at all, and with child porn images, things like that. These men, it was an act of passion, I guess, in many ways. They got 15 years. To my mind, is a political decision. I see the politics in that, the warning to the people of this country from that judge and from the judiciary about what will happen to them if they put up any resistance into the future. Peter, what's your take on the 15-year sentence for these men?
Quite literally, I mean, my thoughts on it are very similar to your own, Finbar. I mean, it's quite simply outrageous. And again, given their age, to echo what you've said, it's effectively a life sentence. And I think the state has, and again, you know, one has to ask questions, I think, about the independence of the judiciary, perhaps, and, you know, how implicitly political the decision and the sentence appear to be. And again, you know, a background issue, you know, that perhaps one could ask would be, you know, we've had the so-called Celtic Tiger, we had the boom, you know, and, you know, how many judges, let's say, and how many occupants of the judiciary and the legal system in general kind of got on that irrational, exuberant gravy train, let's say, and how many of them, you know, have issues in their own lives that they maybe need to consider. I mean, that's probably another aspect to consider there. But quite obviously, what's happened is a marker's been put down where the state and the interests of the state and the banks are mutually aligned. And I mean, again, you can say, what's the purpose of a sort of modern nation state? Is it to protect the rights of capital, or is it to protect the rights of its citizens? And where does that line, how is that calibrated? And quite obviously, it's calibrated in the interests of capital. And of course, the other aspect of how it's implicitly political, right the way to its origin, is the nature of the the security that was sourced from the bank. And of course, it's also interesting that it was a foreign bank. So I mean, it wasn't even the case that it was an Irish bank. And another aspect, just to round out, that I found interesting was when we put up the headlines. I mean, essentially, again, it highlights this, I think, this impulse in the media where effectively they're stenographers for power. We see these, headlines mimicking each other. And again, one wonders, behind the scenes, what's actually happening in terms of how headlines, because a lot of people just read the headlines without actually digging into stories. And I mean, I'm guilty of that myself sometimes. I mean, we're all busy. And so headlines are particularly important. And to what extent, perhaps, is there curation of those headlines, in terms of government press secretaries and so on. And it also raises questions about this revolving door, as it were, but as it is all too apparent. I think many of us are aware of that now, between, let's say, the government press office or government information system, more abstractly, and the newspapers and print media and even the broadcast media.
No, I agree with you. I'm minded particularly of a case in the north of Ireland. I was actually there when this happened, and it was two wonderful Irish women, Grania and Michelle. I won't give their surnames. And so Grania was up in court. This judge was going to come down and take a piece of her land and their property, their home. And then last minute, the night before the judgment, they discovered that this judge had a company, or his wife had a company that was in severe debt to the bank that they were dealing with in this case, and that the bank had given them so much rope in terms of their debt, and maybe even wiped it. I can't remember exactly if they wiped it now. But Justice Horner in that case, I think he might have had some other title as well, but Horner anyway was his name, and he had to recuse himself. And that was just one incident where some Irish women who really did their homework, found out about this guy, found out about his links to the bank in question and how the bank was doing them favors essentially. And he probably felt he had to do them favors back. And so he had to recuse himself from the bench anyway. And he was spitting fire about it because it was a very public incident and it was in a number of newspapers as well. So that link between the banks and the judiciary may not just be kind of a state link. There could be many personal links as well. And I know you have to go now. So do you want to close up on this story with anything before you go? And then myself and Peter will move on with a number of other subjects and topics from this week in Ireland.
Thank you, Finbar. I suppose where I'm coming from it is the human impact that this has on the families of these three men. Two of the men themselves are in poor health, and two of their wives are in very poor health. This has a huge, huge impact, not just on them personally, but on their family and wider relations. And it also has a huge impact on the McGann family. And I'm very mindful of Geraldine and David and Anthony, who are personal friends of mine. And I'm very, very aware of the horrendous effect that this eviction continues to have on them. And I'm also mindful of the hundreds, if not thousands, of people at this stage who have been evicted from their homes. And a warning really to people going forward that, you know, it may not be you today, but it could be you sometime down the line if you lose your job or if you are unable to meet your mortgage repayments because of declining financial circumstances. You may have to walk in those people's shoes someday. So it's a very sad country that we live in. And Judge Martina Baxter said that she was giving those sentences as a warning to anybody who might be considering taking the law into their own hands when it comes to the repossession of properties on behalf of the banks.
Well, if the economic warning signs and red flags that we're seeing now transpire or become the disaster that they seem to be predicting, so we have the production capacity of Germany is collapsing, Irish economy GNP contracted by 8% in the first quarter. If all these things happen, Anna, there is a likelihood, I think, that there's going to be a lot more people getting 15-year sentences and being sent to jail in Ireland for 15 years. Anna, thanks for joining us. Peter, we're going to move on to your story next, your first story, which is about an event that has been happening in Ireland over the last few years called Think Local. And this year, the Think Local festival or seminars had to be cancelled. Do you want to run with that story, Peter?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Finbar. So essentially, the Think Local festival, I mean, this is the second one that they've actually run. And I was on two panels, as it turned out, in I think the inaugural session, which was somewhere in County Westmeath, if I shall say, and essentially was somewhere between, had elements of sort of, even at that stage back in February, kind of a traditional country fair. I mean, anybody certainly in our part of the country who's familiar with something like the Moynalty Steam Thrashing Festival or the Trim Haymaking Festival, or someone who's familiar with, to some extent, maybe like the Ballinasloe Horse Fair. I mean, obviously that's a different and a bigger event, but all of these sort of local, local festivals and vintage rallies and food fairs that really happen without incident and pretty quietly throughout the country during the summer months. This was kind of modeled on that. And I think probably why it was labeled, if you will, by rather sinister forces as being some kind of fascist far-right event was because that built into it, there were a variety of speakers such as Matthias de Smet. He was actually in Ireland, and they also had, I think, Dr. Peter McCullough and some other, let's call them COVID commentators lined up. And these people were very much going to really, I suppose, tell us the truth, or some closer approximation of the truth of the whole COVID, if I could call it the COVID era or the COVID phenomenon. And that had to be, as, let's say, as the state power, should we say, would have perceived that had to be shut down. And that was just one part of it. I mean, there were, at the inaugural event, I mean, certainly...
So what happened here exactly, Peter? These guys, they booked the venue. Somebody, was it the state? Was it individuals? Was it trolls? Who was it that contacted this venue and told them lies about the organisers and about the nature of this event and had it cancelled? Who you don't have to name names, and we don't want to get into legalities here.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm saying this was an organisation did this, or this was individuals, or...
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, rumor has it, let's say, that it was certain, shall we say, well-known individuals. I mean, they would be, connected to other formerly well-known individuals. And I think these people have done, and there's two or more individuals in a let's say, a kind of an orchestrated group, and they have a penchant for threats and intimidation. What those threats and intimidation might be, I'm not sure, but they seem to have a penchant for doing this, and the venues seem to back out pretty quickly. I know, just speaking to some friends about this, I mean, one angle on this as well is, where you have venues, and I think in this case it was landowners who were approached, on the presumption that, given it's the summer, that it'll be again the kind of thing where a field will be rented, and there are two fields, one where people might park and one where events could take place. But in any event, one interesting aspect of this is And really it goes back to, if we trace it back to, again, to the boom years, tax breaks for hotels. And again, we had this proliferation of hotels built because of, the tax breaks that were given. And obviously when the crash came, there were too many, and again, I'm not familiar conversant with the data on it, but there were way too many hotel rooms in the country. So a lot of the hotel stock went into NAMA, and they were, shepherded through that process until they kind of became going concerns again. And again, many of these now are taking money for, let's call it just money for migrants. And I think that there's a kind of an implicit pressure there where I think, business owners probably feel they have to toe the line. And, I can't see where threats and intimidation would carry any real weight other than this implicit kind of threat. Well, you want to keep your business open as a going concern. Well, do you want to keep getting, checks?
It can also be simply threats that there'll be protests outside.
It could be threats that there'll be protests outside. And again, a lot of people might fear this labeling as somehow as far right or fascist, which I feel is a clear case of projection, by the psychological projection by the people actually making the threats. I mean, who are the real thugs in this story?
Yeah, I think there's a development of extremism on both sides in the way people are treating their fellow Irish people, their fellow human beings in many respects as well. And that politics has been taken into a very personal and a very aggressive atmosphere at the moment. So this particular festival, from all appearances and from its history, is something that should be community orientated, is looking at ways to live in a better life, a cleaner life, to improve your well-being. And this now in itself is being caught in the catch-all net of far-right extremism, where you can just label anything. These individuals, I think I know who you're talking about, they used to try to persecute myself and Anna Kavanagh too, and still do sometimes, unsuccessfully. We just ignore them. They're not as well known as some people might think they are. But they seem to be actually creating scenarios that don't exist in this country. They're seeking out fascists. And if they can't find any, they just throw the label at anybody, because their nature is not to actually be political. It's just to be aggressive, from what I can ascertain, Peter. I hope
the other aspect of it is, somewhat counterproductively from their point of view, is the Streisand effect. That actually, certainly on social media, this event got significant leverage from the fact that it was cancelled.
But isn't also the concern that if you take people who don't label themselves politically at all and haven't been political, regular Joe Soaps, the people we work with every day, are what we actually call our community. Most of our community don't have themselves labeled politically. And if they're constantly attacked when they ask questions, when they question things that are happening in their community, if they're in an innocent way asking questions and they're labeled far right, maybe eventually some of them will say, well, maybe we are far right. Maybe we should go and explore what far right is. And so there's a concern that they actually, is not the Streisand effect, some other effect where they actually create the problem that they claim they're fighting.
They actually foment the very thing that they're trying to stop. And actually all this is when we hear talk now about sustainability, almost as the new religion, I mean, think this is implicitly about sustainability. It's about.
We're going to move on to that now. So let's just move on to that now, Peter. This is a headline that you sent from the Times. I just can't see that headline the way I have. Yeah. So farming and politics on collision course over climate change. This is from Sive O'Neill. Thinking in a climate emergency, we all need Irish agriculture to succeed, but it will have to do so on new terms, chiefly for ecological resilience. Do you want to lead with this one as well, Peter? What's the crack with this headline?
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of, it's something that I'm sort of fairly familiar with, when myself and colleagues set up Regenerative Farming Ireland. And again, a lot of people in the traditional sort of agricultural space, or what is termed industrial agriculture, which some see as a pejorative, but you know, it's a fair point. We set that up to try and say, right, you know, farming needs to adapt, it needs to change. I mean, you could argue that one of the things that's killing farming is inputs and input costs. And certainly we see that in relation to, for example, fertilizers and agri-chemicals. I mean, two of the biggest costs, without talking about all of the, you know, labor and land and all of the other costs. But in terms of just the technical inputs, as it were, they're getting more expensive, and they're getting, you know, less sustainable. And they're also having effects, and they are having real effects, I think, on ecology and biodiversity, and that's axiomatic at this stage. So, you know, we would say in Regenerative Farming Ireland that there are other ways. Some people decry it as low input, but I mean, you can maintain similar productivity, similar production levels with less inputs, or with less, let's say, less synthetic inputs. So there are solutions, you know, and I know Stuart Meikle, one of our co-founders and colleague. I mean, he's written extensively on this in ARC 2020. He's written his own blog, Agri-Food Solutions. We did have a report which we sort of self-published, and we gave to certain people in a targeted way, called Farm to Fork 20. Well, now its latest incarnation is Farm to Fork 2030. There are solutions, but what we're seeing this a case of ne'er the twain shall meet, and it seems to be more polarized than ever. And it came into sharp focus in the last 2 weeks with the resignation on the Sunday before last of Padraig Fogarty from the Irish Wildlife Trust. And actually, he'd resigned, I think, or announced his resignation on Twitter on Sunday morning of last week. And he was in a feature on the 1 o'clock news on RTE1 then, and it proliferated through the mainstream and the print media and social media. And why he resigned, just to kind of give a bit of the backstory, was sometime I think within 2 weeks prior to that, he had written a blog post where he had let's say, I won't say accused, but he had mentioned that the main farming organizations were lurching to the far right, and he also allegedly compared them to the DUP. I say that because I say allegedly because I didn't read the full blog initially. Now, what happened subsequently was that apparently sections of the blog mentioning the far right, mentioning the DUP, were redacted. The article was left in place, but certain comments were redacted, and views were expressed to say, you know, look, the Irish Wildlife Trust board should have stood by their man, as it were, and they should have either pulled the whole article or left it in place as it had originally been written, rather than censoring. Quite, you know, I suppose tellingly, we seem to be in the age of censorship, so it was telling, I think, that they decided to redact certain sections. And there has been speculation that there may have been some pressure from those same farming organizations. And given that, you know, what they did, Padraig felt that he had to resign. And it is a sad day. I mean, I think Padraig, being familiar with some of the environmental NGOs, Padraig was, I think, a more sensible voice, a voice of reason, because there are certain well-known alarmists, and I think we might touch on those shortly. There are people who are engaged in divisive tactics, shall we say. Padraig, I think it's sad that he's left, because you know, he was a voice of reason. You know, we could speculate as to why he did what he did. I don't think he's caved into to panic as such. So I'm not sure what, you know, where we go from here, but that conversation needs to happen between farmers and environmentalists. One thing I would say about the environmental movement, they do highlight problems. They never speak about solutions. And, you know, part of the problem is, I think, they don't have anybody who's, I think, technically adept on the agricultural side who actually can purvey those solutions to farmers. So they've lost a huge amount of credibility among farmers. My personal opinion is he made a huge mistake by even mentioning far right, because at this stage, you know, and he also mentioned, I think, in his tweet, conspiracy theories. And I don't think that's helpful. I think it's
Yeah,
divisive.
what do you expect farmers to do when on the news they're looking at these highly red-colored maps on the weather and on the news about heat waves and about how the whole world is about to explode and temperatures are given, and then they just go on to a normal meteorological online program and they look at those countries and those temperatures are not reflected in the standard weather reports of those countries. So you can get into the whole complicated science of it, in which the farmer is not educated and is not going to understand, or you can look at the simplistic contradictions, because the entire conversation so far has been on the premise that there is a climate crisis and there is something that some people may be exaggerating it. But when you look at the facts that when you do your own research, you go onto the NASA site, you go onto the US National Meteorological sites, you look at the European Space Agency, what they're doing, and they're tweaking all the historical data. And they're changing it, and they're lowering the high temperatures from years ago to make it look as though the temperatures of today are the record-breaking temperatures, which in many cases they're not. And so when these simplistic, uncomplicated, but obvious contradictions are presented to farmers, and then on the other hand, on one hand, I've been told you have to completely change the way you do things. You have to cull your cattle. X amount have to get out of the business altogether. You're going to have to turn smaller farms, conglomerate them into bigger farms taken over by big capital, because you're going to need that to make these changes. You know, that's on one side. And yet the evidence seems really, in a simplistic way, contradictory on the other side. And yet you're asking the farmers to do this. So you were talking about exaggerations earlier on. You have an image that you sent to us, Peter, and we'll just have a look at it now. It's one of numerous images from this guy, this tweeter, John Gibbons. Oh my F God, we'll presume that's the F word. Turns out the day after tomorrow could possibly be the year after next. We're hanging by a thread from full-scale climate collapse that would be far, far worse than even our direst imaginings. So this is the panic talk that you're talking about here, Peter. We've been hearing this since I was a kid. You know, that, you know, in X amount of years, we're all going to drown, we're going to freeze, we're going to be electrocuted, we're going to spontaneously combust. And it's never happened. What's your take on this? Because it seems to me that you are accepting that there is a climate problem. What is the degree of exaggeration? Where are your boundaries with this?
You know, it's funny. I mean, first of all, just to say that, you know, this individual here is a well-known alarmist, and I would say, you know, isn't favorably predisposed to most of the farming community, despite the fact that he comes from a farming background. So he actually got pulled up by a real environmental scientist, John Foley, I think formerly of Project Drawdown, and I think he was in the University of Minnesota, but again, a real climate scientist, John Foley, who I suppose said the Guardian should you know, maybe check themselves on what he calls sloppy reporting, and saying that there's actually no chance that the Gulf Stream, or indeed it's the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, is going to cease or collapse anytime soon. And what I think, pardon me, what I think, another thing that intrigues me is when it became, when climate science, pardon me, when climate science became solely focused on CO2, and when we developed this carbon myopia. And I know in Regenerative Farming Ireland on Facebook, we had a couple of what you might call old school environmentalists, people who were around in the 60s and 70s. And where the main concern at that stage was pollution. And it's, you know, it hasn't gone away. You know, we still should be concerned about pollution. And we rarely see, you know, we rarely see enough, I think, about pollution and about ecotoxicity, probably because of this singular focus on carbon dioxide. And, you know, again, the issue of pollution didn't go away. And what it also ties into, I suppose, is this, what we're seeing now at an accelerated rate, this progressive deindustrialization of Europe, of, you know, heavy industry and so on. because essentially what happened was, you know, a lot of industry, heavy industry, migrated from Europe and North America to East Asia, East and Southern Asia. So essentially the pollution that would have been associated with that, which was a real issue, you know, I mean, particulate matter in the atmosphere, which incidentally also ties in with these images that we see in China, for example, and in India, where we see, you know, poor quality air and smog, and we see people wearing masks. And in mask wearing in East Asia wasn't because of, you know, infectious airborne viral particles. It was actually because of combustion, or let's say combustion derived particulate matter in the atmosphere. So, and probably was no good for that either. But, you know, the issue should be, I think, there are still issues around pollution and ecotoxicity and biodiversity loss. I do think, like most threats, it's probably amplified to a point where, you know, it creates this public panic and this sense of, you know, God, we're doomed. And I don't think that's in anybody's interest. And in fact, you know, all you get then is you get these binary, you know, you either accept the science or you deny the science. And it isn't that simple. And you get accusations of climate denialism. And what people, you know, actual professional scientists, and of course, if you say that, then they'll say, well, are you a climate scientist? And to which my reply would be, well, what is a climate scientist and what do you mean with climate? Because if climate is everything, well, then nothing's climate.
But you don't have to be a climate scientist. When you read a headline saying scientists say, and meteorologists say the temperature is 51 degrees in X place, and you then go on to their local weather reports and see that it's actually 41 or 42, and that is not always the temperature there, but it's common to have temperatures there. And that's the simplicity of this for people who will never get into the complexity of the science. On a personal level, I agree with you that we should be talking about air pollution, particularly in urban areas, and how to address that. And combustion is a problem there. And so having some other kind of vehicle transport. But this idea that cow farts are such a significant problem that we have to cull our cattle, it's just, I don't see anybody being convinced by this, especially when you also look at the same time, the US and some of the biggest drivers from a political polity global level of this change are in the Democratic Party in the United States, and yet Biden is signing up for licenses for drilling and exploration left, right, and center, in complete contradiction to his proclaimed global man-made climate change policies. And so a lot of things just don't make sense, and yet we're asking farmers to indebt themselves. We're asking them to take a massive gamble and to change the way they do things. And we're asking some farmers to stop farming. And maybe after generations of farming, that's what we're expecting. And I don't think the government are convincing. I don't think the science that we're being presented with is convincing. I believe that there's alternative science out there. I've seen some of that alternative science. You've seen it as well. But the farmers are being denied the right to see it, and instead they're being labelled and slandered as far right and extremists and conspiracy theorists, which is bringing us back to the origins of this conversation. So it would appear to me at this stage, if you don't agree with the state and the corporate narrative on something, you must want to put people in concentration camps. So that's what far right means, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's really that's essentially the connotations or the kind of mental map in terms of what people associate in very simplistic terms, images of far right, you know, fascist organizations with. And while there is much to criticize the IFA about, there is much to criticize them about. And I wouldn't be necessarily a fan of the IFA in terms of, and I say technical competence, because I think, you know, with the IFA, the issue is, you know, what's an average farmer? Where is the dividing line between, you know, what is a family farm and where does agribusiness begin and farming end? And in terms of the options that are available to farmers in terms of how they can enhance the viability of the farming businesses, you know, I think the IFA has been pretty poor on that as a whole. There's another aspect to it, however, you know, when we hear talk about, you know, cutting, you know, 200,000 head from the national herd, you know, that there are people, and again, people who aren't involved in farming may not be aware of all the nuance, that there, you know, there's been a shift really to dairy production And it speaks to, again, what isn't probably known widely in the public. I mean, the 10-year plans, and really you got to say, what's driving, a power center in this state is agribusiness. And when you have this mutual alignment of the agribusiness, large agribusiness multinationals with the state, with, the IFA thrown into that mix, I mean, that's, there's a certain sort of, that is implicitly political as well. But what we never hear about is, the mental health issues in the farming community. And so, for example, recently, and this was reported on social media, I think within the last week or two, there was a study done by Teagasc and UCD where they found that, and it was a survey, so that there may be some biases built in there implicitly, like in all surveys. But the headline figure, one of the headline figures they came up with was that 24% of farmers were considered at risk of suicide. Now, if that was in any other sector, there would be a national outcry. And again, I think what we need to be mindful of, and I think what some of the environmental people need to be mindful of, is just in an industry where farmers feel compelled to kind of get on this debt pathway and path dependence, and this increased level of production, increased specialization, and to become more indebted, and as we mentioned earlier on, with falling price of milk. And as well as that, in terms of genuine issues of sustainability, to become, for example, more dependent on imports, because there was a headline, I think, in last week's Examiner Farming Supplement, which said that we should, to sort of offset the reduction in cow numbers, we should focus more on high-yielding cows. Now, the issue is, where, high-yielding cows, cows maybe, as the saying goes, milking off their back, they need a lot more energy. Those animals are going to need more what's called supplementary feeding. They can't rely solely on pasture. And invariably, that's going to mean, in all likelihood, more imports of imported feed. So that's going to be more ships coming from, for example, Latin America and coming to Irish ports, or coming into Rotterdam and having feeder ships then traveling, to Ireland.
To stop cow farts, they're going to actually, to save the planet and to stop cows farting, they're going to slaughter them younger or try to fatten them up more. And that's actually probably going to cut them all down.
That's going to be counterproductive as well, because, of course, that's also going to necessitate more, because we don't have the arable base here. Although, a huge, the overwhelming proportion of, for example, grain that we grow here goes into animal feed rather than human food. They're also going to put pressure on the system, and that's going to mean also more imports. So again, because of this carbon myopia, or methane myopia, you might say, the system's actually going to be made less sustainable. And again, when you have this, and maybe perhaps even us speaking here in a critical sense, when all farmers hear is, negativistic messages, and, oh, you're killing the planet, or you're poisoning the rivers, or you're destroying your soil. Now, there are issues with all of these, but they're never presented with viable solutions, either by the environmental people or by their own farming organizations, and that has to be said. So the farming organizations do bear some responsibility. And again, somebody like Padraig Fogarty would be aware of that. But again, farmers feel, and I've seen some of the engagement between Padraig and farmers over the years, and even Padraig, who would be more reasonable, he tends to get guys, and we're all human, tends to get guys' backs up. So farmers feel, I think, and particularly the younger guys, because, they have aspirations, they have maybe families, they have bills to pay, and they feel, that, listen, I got to make I have to generate a certain income to maintain a certain standard of living. And the environmental people, I think, need to realize that there's that, but there's also the issue of the older farming cohort. And this is a kind of a general point on the Western seaboard, who would be more suckler farmers. And all they get is, you're not as technically efficient as you need to be. But of course, they're a very important component of our indigenous food security, the suckler cow. But they're also, in terms of animal, the care and attention of animals, guys who've done that for their whole lives, maybe 40, 50 years in some cases. Now, there's the other issues about farm safety and so on, which are collateral to that. But, you know, there's also the issue of marts. And of course, there was massive consolidation within the last 20 years in the mart sector. But there's this mental health aspect. There's also the social aspect, which ties in with mental health. And there's a whole
what we're saying here is
aspect.
putting farmers under putting farmers under more pressure with this climate thing increases that's kind of what we're saying.
Absolutely.
But we're going to move on from far right farmers, Peter, to demonstrations outside refugee centres or proposed asylum and refugee centres in Ireland. And these demonstrations are again being labelled as far right. And maybe there are some people involved that are far right, but I think there's a lot of locals who are just generally concerned, and maybe those concerns ought to be addressed. We have a video here, in fact, of Ballybrack on Thursday, and things got pretty violent in Ballybrack. So here's this video from Ballybrack on Thursday, Peter. Looks like it got pretty violent. This is outside a proposed asylum or refugee centre. There's locals there, but there are also people that appear to have travelled to Ballybrack. These scenes are becoming increasingly common. Demonstrations, quite often pro and anti type demonstrations, counter demonstrations. This is the first time that I've seen the Gardaí getting picked on this particular issue. I suppose people have a right to demonstrate and protest. What are your overall feeling on the atmosphere that's developing in Ireland? Again, we spoke about this far-right accusations, things like that. But the general atmosphere that's building, that to my mind seems quite divisive and seems to be an atmosphere that refutes balanced debate in favour of name-calling, slandering, and what is becoming more and more likely physical interactions. What's your take on it, Peter?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's well, one take I often wonder, you know, who's actually making these decisions? Because it seems to me that many of these high-level policy decisions are actually being taken by or in power centers or in the interests of forces, economic forces, which actually derive outside the state. You know, I mean, for example, I recall an article by no less a name than David McWilliams some months ago, within the last 3-4 months, I think in the Irish Times, and I'm purely just going on by memory here, you know, where he says that, you know, we actually don't have very many, we're not that densely populated, we don't have that many people in the country. And some commentators have even said, you know, well, back in the mid-19th century, we actually had a population of 8.5 million. We're the only country, I think, on the planet where in the past 150 years, the population, the general trend has been decline. And they're using all of these issues as, I suppose, a justification for what we can see as mass inward migration. Again, one of those issues where no debate, no discussion is allowed. And again, there's a lot of nuance in that debate. What is a refugee? What is an economic migrant? Because I think they are different things. Is it right that, you know, countries like Ireland, countries in Western Europe, is it moral? I won't say right. Is it moral? Is there a moral case or an ethical case to be made that, you know, we should support refugees from, for example, Syria or Ukraine? You know, you might say that as a practical matter, as well as a moral matter, it might be more appropriate if the countries, you know, if they were actually accommodated maybe in countries closer to the, you know, within a few hundred miles, you know, a kind of a typical train or bus journey, you know, because as a practical matter, I mean, how do you actually move huge numbers of people from somewhere like Syria, somewhere like Ukraine, to the Netherlands or to Britain or to Ireland? I mean, how are tens of thousands of people moved progressively over periods of time? So is there a moral case for, you know, accommodating refugees? That's an arguable case. Economic migrants, it's quite obvious that there are also economic migrants. And if we look at some of the data which I've seen recently in terms of the nationalities of those who are kind of coming into the country, we can see that there are, I think, a lot of Georgians, Moldovans, Albanians, And one wonders, there was no active conflict in those regions. So can we call those, asylum seekers? Why are they asylum seekers? But again, refugee, asylum seeker, economic migrant. Where are the nuance in those? Do we need to even get into definitions? I mean, if we speak to definitions, I mean, it's almost like. But again, in legal nuance, definitions are important. I mean, it's something we also see with the hate speech laws. How do you define hate? But again, there's just this miasma of lies and confusion and obfuscation, and obviously in the service of powerful vested interests. And essentially, it seems that we seem to be almost an analog of what, or not an analog, but a corollary of what Ukraine is. Ukraine is this deflationary hub in Eastern Europe, and we seem to be an inflationary hub in Western Europe. So, for example, and I'll round out on this, I mean, if you look at recent events in the last 3 years, if you look at birth rates, most of Western Europe is seeing had a declining birth rate anyway. We are actually seeing an increased birth rate. And one wonders, how certain medical, in inverted commas, interventions, the effects they've had, how's that being offset by, cultural shifts and increased birth rates in terms of, how people are coming in. And, people who begin this conversation, and maybe, and there are some actual right-wing people who actually, do engage in kind of, they're trying to kind of kill the nation. And I do wonder about that sometimes. There is a conversation to be had there, and it's probably why someone like Viktor Orban, gets or attracts some of the opprobrium that he does. There are forces which are inflating our economy, and again, one wonders, you need to maybe do a thought experiment and ask the question, where will we be in 2050? What will the country look like? What the demographics of our population? Will we have what will the average age be? What will the age distribution be? What will the income distribution be? What kind of industries will we have? What will farming look like? What might fishing look like if it's still?
I think isn't the argument be made that the Irish people don't have a right to have that discussion? We don't have a right to talk about collectively what our demographic will be into the future, what our culture of a country will be into the future. We're told that we're racist if we even raise those issues. So we've been forced to talk about these issues purely in terms of housing and purely in terms of demand and supply, because you'll be considered to be far right, uncouth, right-wing fascist if you discuss these issues in the context of demographics into the future, of cultural and demographic makeup. And I think that the collective people of Ireland, everybody in the island who's on the island, have a right to have that discussion collectively together without being called names. Last year in 2022, there were 220,000 national insurance numbers given out to people from outside of Ireland that were not Ukrainian refugees. And yet, when we're being told about the asylum applicant figures and the refugee figures, we're being spoken about them in the tens of thousands. And not necessarily Ukrainian refugees, but asylum applicants from elsewhere. And yet, it doesn't seem to be reflected in the CSO statistics and in what we're seeing on the street. And so there's an abject dishonesty in how that's being addressed with the Irish people for a start. But we're going to watch this space because this issue is not going away. I'm concerned about the violent and the divisive atmosphere that's being developed on both sides because of this. I don't want to see anybody hurt. I don't want to see anybody injured. The people that are coming here, I believe, have been invited here by the Irish state to supply cheap labour into the future, because our own young people are leaving the country in droves and we're taking in people. None of it makes sense. Anyway, we need to move on, Peter, because we've got two subjects left to look at and our time is pretty limited. You were amused, to say the least, about the appointment of Jacinta Arden, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, to at least one, I think it could be two roles in Harvard University, basically planning on censoring the world. You want to lead with that one, Peter?
Yes, I was, and this story is a number of months old, but it just came to sort of my attention in the last week. So the former New Zealand leader Jacinta Arden, who was lauded as, I think, when she became the New Zealand Prime Minister in 2017, not the first female Prime Minister of New Zealand. And I've actually drawn a blank. I'm trying to think of the previous lady who had been Helen something. I've forgotten her name, but she became I think certainly the youngest woman and one of the youngest leaders in New Zealand at 37 in 2017. And really what emerged during the COVID phenomenon was, there was a seminal moment where, she, flanked by governmental bureaucrats, if I recall, said that people should seek should see the government as their sole source of truth, or single source of truth, I think it was. So it's become evident now that I think New Zealand, and I think this has been reported somewhat. I mean, it's been largely reported on social media, probably ignored largely on the mainstream, where the death rate in New Zealand has reached a 100-year high. So in the aftermath of certain medical interventions, it appears. So I think her popularity certainly declined. She's now no longer New Zealand Prime Minister, and a lot of speculation ensued about what her likely future would be. And she was, sort of a poster child for globalism, and it was assumed that she might move to a significant senior position in some global multinational or something. But she's popped up again in Harvard University, I think in the Kennedy Business School, and she's got two fellowships. And from my just scanning through it again involves, I think, information. And a point I actually made previously was, if we see society, or even global society, as an information ecosystem, one of the reasons, for example, why we're probably not all working from home all the time now, why we don't all have to have a health pass, why it probably isn't a fully digitized transactional system yet, why cash hasn't been obliterated, is because, the free flow of information is still facilitated by the internet. So I think we're going to see a trend. We're going to see, I think, a lot more surveillance. We're going to see a lot more biometrics. We're going to see a lot more digitization. I think we're probably going to see something like, if people don't, I'd say wake up. I don't like the term wake up, but if people don't become aware of some of the issues, and if people simply just say no, and there's certain very, very simple things you can do. Otherwise we're going to see something like a future, where you're going to need biometric information to submit biometric information to go to the internet. So, we will probably move beyond the censorship if the censorship era becomes locked in and people become acclimatized to that. And this is where the next generation, I think, is key. This is why, they're coming for the children. The social engineers are coming for the children, because they're going to be stuck on screens for a huge proportion of their working lives, and possibly their leisure time. So that's where they get information. And again, information allows us to make decisions. Information allows us to navigate reality. And that's why this, fifth generation warfare, information warfare, is where we are. And I think she's a central pillar in that. And, there will still be a lot of people who look up to her. And I think that's probably a mistake. So it's interesting that she's emerged in the role that she has. But I think she's probably, I think it's fair to say, a divisive figure now at this stage. So we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll see where it goes, and what she might do.
Isn't it a real sign of the developing technocracy, if you want to call it that, whereby academia is being empowered to such a degree to be the mechanism used to take control, to reshape how we think, and to take back control that the internet maybe has liberated us in many ways, and they want to take that control back. Arden is the personification of that, She's going into Harvard. What she does in Harvard, what other people do when they go into academia addressing this issue of misinformation and censorship and things like that, is that their work in there will influence our lives. So although it may seem quite separate now, the idea that Arden, for example, is getting these two posts in Harvard, it will impact our lives in ways that we can't see. We're going to follow that over the next few weeks, the general subject matter, because the European Union in August is introducing new rules as well for social media companies, which is going to tighten everything up in terms of how we communicate. We're way over time, Peter. Our last story is a very sad story. I've cried a few tears over the last 24 hours watching different videos. I've learned a lot about Sinead O'Connor that I didn't know over the last 24 hours to 48 hours as well. Sinead O'Connor has passed away. Her son took his own life 18 months ago. Her last tweet was a chant or a prayer for mothers whose sons have taken their own lives. And this really dragged her to the very bottom. And although Sinead O'Connor has been in bad places in the past, the loss of her son seems to have taken her to a place where she didn't want to be here on the planet anymore. What is your general gut feeling about Sinead O'Connor's loss? I'm surprised how the world has reacted. She's got praise and commiserations have been extended from right around the world, from figures that you wouldn't expect, politicians, movie actors, people in the music industry. How does this hit you, Peter?
I think the first thing to say is it's extremely sad. It's tragic. The first thought when one hears now of a young person, when I say young, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, I thought, oh, another one, because we're living in the era of, increased death rates among, let's say, young and middle-aged people. It appears that's not the case in this instance. Extremely sad, extremely tragic. Another beautiful, talented woman. And funnily enough, I was minded of another very, very talented, very beautiful and young woman who was taken before her time as well a couple of years ago, Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries. So again, when to fabulous, to wonderful, talented people. I think there were issues. I mean, they had issues, but that's part of this sort of if you want to call it, the sort of wonderful tapestry and genuine diversity of humanity. And who's to criticize anybody? I mean, none of us are perfect, and maybe all of us have had issues at some times, and it's part of who we are as human beings. Very, very sad. And I know there may have been issues as well. So in terms of obviously her son took his own life, I think 18 months ago, I think, or thereabouts. And again, it showed this almost transcendental, this very intense love that a mother had for her child. What was going on in her mind, we can only speculate, but it's just, it's one of the big stories of the week, and I think deservedly so. So may she rest in peace.
We're hearing more and more about young people taking their own lives, especially young males in Ireland. And I think she really does represent a mother, many Irish mothers, in a very real way, in the pain that she has gone through, especially over the last 18 months or so. I remember distinctly, I was a massive Bob Dylan fan, and I remember distinctly her performance at Madison Square Garden, where she was supposed to sing a song called I Believe in You, which was a kind of a gospel, one of Bob Dylan's first gospel style albums. And she had torn up a picture of the Pope because of child sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church. Many people in Ireland were not aware of those scandals, or were only starting to become aware of them, and couldn't understand what she had done in many ways. But her defiance when she was booed, and can I just say, at Madison Square Garden, if you listen to the crowd, there's as many people cheering her as booing her. But again, we focus on the negative. So she stood her ground. She had an innocence, a presence, and a dignity, and yet refusal to bend the knee in terms of how she performed that night. And then she came out with Bob Marley's War, and I was so moved, and so it was the first time I saw a genuine political act, and that's what that was. So It's sad to see her going. Her music, even recently, her performances have been fantastic. I just watched last night her Rainy Day in Soho that she performed on the Late Late Show a few years ago, while she was wearing her Islamic dress, a beautiful red garment. I thought that was one of her best performances. So she was somebody who wasn't fading musically or in her ability. In fact, I thought she was getting better as she was getting older. So it's a major loss musically and culturally, and I think personally to most people in Ireland.
And I think also as well, Finbar, just in this era where, and it's been a thread through this edition of Lookout, you know, where we're seeing really the boot on the neck, if I could use that image. You know, we're seeing power flexing, exercising its muscle, and we've seen that for the past we'll be into four years of it shortly. And you know what her defiance spoke to, her defiance in the face of powerful forces spoke to, was actually a very, if you will, a very dignified face of humanity. You know, where, you know, somebody who, as diminutive as her, also had a powerful presence, and had that dignified defiance to actually push back against, I would say, repressive forces of power and negative influence. So that was something. And again, I wouldn't have agreed with everything she did, but you know, as a human being, her dignity and defiance of power speaks to that implicit human dignity which she had, and which I think is probably an example to many people.
Sinead O'Connor, more than anything else, human being. I think she displayed and she lived her humanity on her sleeve. And some people might have seen that as inappropriate, but you know something, sometimes real life has to break through the fantasy that we're presenting by the media and by our politicians. That's all that we have time for today, Peter. Thanks for joining us. Folks, thanks for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe where you can. As always, we're battling the algorithms. Peter, you'll join us again?
I'll come back whenever I can, Finbar. Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure. And thanks for the invite.
No problem. I know you're a busy man. You're lecturing up there in UCD, and I hope you're passing lots of students. Passing them and not failing them. Join us again next week, folks. Peter will talk to you in a few weeks' time.
Thanks, Finbar. God bless.